Hi everyone, I'm Jo. I'm going to do a short talk this evening about my work as a search angel. I have made a PowerPoint presentation mostly so that you've got something to look at because I'm not hugely comfortable being on camera. But this is what I'm going to cover. I'm going to just talk a little bit about me and how I came to get involved in this work. I'm going to talk about what a search angel is and just as importantly, what it isn't. I'm going to touch on some of the ethics that are really important to me with this kind of activity, some of the questions and sort of that I get and the techniques that I use. And then I'll just round off with some reflections that I have having done this for quite some time. The image that I've used there is one that really resonates with me. It's pretty stark, I think. As far as I'm aware, the artist doesn't have any connection to adoption, but it really kind of spoke to me as an adoptee. It's that kind of looking into a void, looking desperately for faces that you recognise and not seeing anything that reflects you. So I thought that was quite an interesting kind of image. So obligatory kind of picture of me as a little adoptee there. I am a fairly typical domestic infant adoption from the end of the mass adoption era. So I was born in 1975. My adoption was finalised 6 months later in 1976. I was basically moved from one white lower middle class family in Surrey to a slightly higher lower middle class family a little bit further away in West Sussex. I have an older brother who's also adopted and a younger sister who is my parents' biological child. So a mixed family. I started to sort of come to grips with my adoption probably about 15 years ago, and I read The Primal Wound, which is obviously a kind of a foundational book for lots of adoptees. And I read it all the way through once and thought, doesn't reflect me at all. I was very deeply in the fog. And then I sort of read it again probably about 2 years later, and it really hit me like a ton of bricks. And then I suppose my kind of process of coming out of the fog really escalated around the time of the JCHR inquiry a couple of years ago. And that was when I started meeting and talking to a lot of different adoptees. And that's how I met lots of my friends who are now co founders with me of the adult adoptee movement. My background, career wise, is as an archivist and records manager. And there's a snapshot of a portion of my family tree there, which has got about 7,800 people in it at the moment. I've always been really interested in family history, even before I worked in that sort of in that line. I was always quite obsessed, I would say, as a child with sort of family trees, and I can remember drawing out sort of lineages of the royal family and characters from books. And I never made the connection to being an adoptee, but of course, it's quite clear to me now why I was so interested in that, because it's all about where you fit in a family, where you don't fit in a family, and sort of understanding where your place is in the world and with other human beings. So even though it's not something that I do as a profession anymore, so I sort of left that behind me, but I still continue it as a hobby. And for some years now, I've been supporting particularly other adoptees with this kind of work. So this is what I asked ChatGPT what a search angel would look like, and this is what it gave me. And I think I'm fairly happy with that. I think it's pretty fair representation. I don't know how it knew that I've got blonde curly hair, but that's quite odd. But a search angel is generally a volunteer who gives their time and resources to help other adoptees find their family, trace their records. They are very often adoptees themselves and will quite often have a background not only in tracing their own family, but having done a bit of extra study. Perhaps they might be an expert in DNA or a particular type of record, but they're volunteers who give their time and they usually would get in touch with a search angel on Facebook. There are various groups that they sort of advertise in. And yeah, it's just a bit of sort of a public service for people who want to support adoptees impacts the way that they weren't supported. And that's certainly what drives me to want to do it. I could have done with a lot of help when I started because it's not as straightforward as it should be. Um, just to be clear, though, that search angels are generally working with public information, so they don't have access generally to sort of um, paywalled special services like government sort of databases, but they do have sort of skills in searching public information. Probably good to be clear about what they are not. So they are not in any way kind of regulated, and you do need to be aware of that if you're using a search angel. It is just a volunteer and someone trying to help you out. So it's probably worth asking a few kind of probing questions about what their experience is. And they are absolutely not regulated to do formal intermediary work. So if what you want is a kind of a licensed third party, you need to make sure you're going to a proper intermediary agency regulated by Ofsted, I would suggest. But I do it just because I love it. I think it's just an incredible thing to be able to do to help people, and I obviously love genealogy. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the ethics that sort of govern the way that I approach this work. That image there is the house that was owned by my foster carers. So I look at this picture quite a lot and think about 8-day-old me being carried in through that front door and being extremely alone, I would say. So it's a picture that means a lot to me. But in terms of ethics, I think a lot about confidentiality when I'm working with clients. Obviously, it's really, really important to keep people's information and their stories completely confidential. I don't share other people's stories. That's an absolute no. Boundaries are also incredibly important. I think one of the benefits of working with someone who is an adoptee themselves is that they understand what you're going through, and so they can be particularly supportive. But I always want to make sure that I'm not somebody's sole means of support, because that's just not something that I can offer. It's not a sensible approach. So one of the first questions that I always ask people is, what support do you have around you? Do you have friends, family, colleagues, and a therapist? Because however far you go on this journey, you're going to need somebody that you can share with, because it can be a real emotional ride. So that's really important. Another one is transparency. So we will always ask an adoptee, if I find something that's unpleasant, do you want me to tell you? And every single person has said yes, please. And that's exactly what I would say. And I think it's really important. So if I find difficult information, if I find that somebody's relative, I don't know, has got a sort of a nasty criminal conviction, or there's a piece in the papers and it's just an unpleasant story, I will pass that information on. I will obviously do it as gently and sensitively as possible, but I don't hide information from people, because I always would want to know. And I think it's really important because lots of us have experienced gatekeeping of our information, and I'd rather have the information warts and all. So that's kind of a standard for me. And I suppose I just always think about what a privilege it is to do this work. I think it's an incredible honour when people share their stories and their documentation, their paperwork with me. I know that in my case, for about 15 years, while I was trying to find my family, I all I had was my adoption file, and I know every line in that, and I've considered everything that's written in there. Does it mean X? Does it mean Y? Going round and round the houses. So it's a real privilege when people are prepared to share their story with you, and it's often the first time that they've shared their story with somebody. There's lots of people, and I would say particularly men, who don't often share um, their adoption story, and it's only when they start thinking about family that they begin talking about it more. So it's an honour. In terms of the questions that I get asked, they generally fall into a few camps. The first one is somebody who just wants to know a bit about their records. So they might want to know what's out there, how do I go about getting it? and I can support them with that. And sometimes that will be the end of it. They just want to think about it for a while. It might be a couple of years before they move forward. It might be that that's enough information for them and they don't want to do anything more. The more common query is obviously around tracing. So a really typical question will be, I've got my mother's name and some very, very basic details about where she lived and her date of birth. Can you tell me where she is? Can I find her? That's obviously a really common one. And what I will do is try and use sort of public records to trace forward and find if that person got married, had other children, where they might live right now. DNA has become a really important area, I've seen recent years for adoptees. And a really common question here will be, well, I know who my mother is and I've perhaps found her, but I don't know who my father is. He's not named on my paperwork. And so I've taken a DNA test and I've been hit with all these matches. And I don't know what any of it means. And can you help me find my father? And then also for genealogy. So sadly, sometimes people find that their parents have passed before they found them, and it might be that there's no immediate family for them to talk to. There are perhaps sort of siblings around, but they just want to know, who were my grandparents, who were my great grandparents, where do I fit, where's my family from? Again, it's that idea of trying to understand where you fit in the great story of the human race. So that's another kind of class of questions that I get asked about quite a bit. So just a bit about the techniques that I use. There'll probably be nothing hugely surprising here. I use, I subscribe to some of the big genealogical databases. I'm a particular user of Ancestry and Find My Past and some other free services. The Mormon Church actually do the most fantastic work in family history, if you can get past the fact that they're doing it because they want to baptize dead people. But there's some fantastic resources available online. It's really incredible what you can get. And so Ancestry will show you things like birth, marriage, and death records, and electoral rolls and military records. So it's all about understanding how those records fit together. What I will often move on to fairly quickly is social media. And here, Facebook is particularly useful when you're trying to trace people, even though there are whole groups of people who don't use Facebook, and there are particularly obviously the younger generation doesn't. It's still a really good place to start if you're trying to find someone, because you can sometimes find them directly, and then if you've got their page, then great, you've got a way to contact them. But if you can't, you can often use, if you can identify other people in the family who are on Facebook, you can use friend lists to make sure you've got the right person. I do quite a lot of things like searching people's open profiles for the word birthday. And if you see people wishing them happy birthday, you can be sure you've got the right individual. So it's all about sort of moving between social media and then the formal official records, and just trying gradually to work out whether you've got someone. I quite often will look at local community Facebook group. So if someone's got a closed profile, but you know they're from a particular area, you might see them posting in their local kind of community group. So social media is kind of a really incredible resource. LinkedIn is also good, even though sometimes people don't use LinkedIn much. If they've got a page there, you obviously know what they do for a living and you've got a potential way of contacting them. So it's really important to get your head around that. Newspapers are another area that I use, and most local newspaper websites are free, and they have often an online archive for free again. I also subscribe to a couple of sort of bigger collections of historic newspapers. But newspapers are great because you can get things like birth, marriage, and death announcements. And sometimes those will include sort of wider details of the family involved. You can get things like obituaries and sort of local news items, which can be really illuminating and tell you a bit about that family and give you clues about where people are. And then just a representation of DNA there again. So when someone tests their DNA, what you're hoping for is obviously some really close matches that will help you find the person that they're looking for. But I mean, in my case, I think the closest matches that I had a couple of second cousins twice removed, so not great. But in my circumstance, I had a candidate for my father. So I was trying to use DNA to prove a theory, and that's a good position to be in. Sometimes people don't have that theory, they don't have that kind of hypothesis about who their father might be, and they're literally just starting from scratch. And it's I mean, there's really some fantastic resources out there to help people get to grips with DNA, but sometimes it's really helpful to have somebody else look at it for you, particularly if you've got only distant matches. So I've done a lot of work with DNA, and it's um, fascinating work. It's a real puzzle. It's brilliant. The tools like Ancestry and MyHeritage and 23andMe, they've really built a lot into their tools to help you understand it. But occasionally, if I get a really complicated case, I will refer to some of the search angels who specialise in DNA, who are really, really great. It's a really great community of search angels. People reach out and support each other and help, and there's some really amazing people doing fantastic work. So this picture, I quite like this one. This was something that I first saw on a blog on howtobeadopted.com, which many of you will know. The artist is Becca Smith there. And again, as an adoptee, this really spoke to me. I mean, it's classic, isn't it? That you're looking at a picture and you feel completely different and like there are pieces of you missing. And I always felt very strongly that when people looked at pictures of our family, this is what they saw. So I think this is quite an interesting image for adoptees to think about. But in terms of reflections with the work that I've done over the years with people, I mean, there's a few key themes that come out really. It's I've heard a lot of stories about different interactions with adoption support teams and social workers more generally, and I think there is a real need to educate social workers, particularly. There's a need for education about adoption with lots of professional teachers, midwives and so forth. But social workers is a particular issue. I still hear a lot of stories about people feeling that they're being talked down to, that they're being told they should feel lucky, and just not getting the sort of open dialogue that you would want. And that's, I think, a real shame. And it's particularly hard for adoptees who are having the most difficult conversations of their lives anyway, and they're feeling like they're sort of being made to feel awkward or difficult, or it's just not the way that it should be in this day and age. So I think that's an ongoing issue and something I'd really like to see change. I also think quite a lot about reunion support. I mean, there's no support for adult adoptees in terms of mental health. There really is nothing meaningful out there. And there's absolutely nothing in terms of support for reunions specifically. And it's such an incredible emotional upheaval. And it's just wrong that there isn't support. I think sometimes when we talk about intermediary services, that gets conflated with reunion support, and they're just not the same thing. I think most intermediaries would say that they try to be supportive. Of course they do, and there's lots of them who do a fantastic job and will provide, um, you know, a great kind of help along that way. But it's not proper support. It's not long term. It's not someone that you can go back to repeatedly as things get tricky. And so people all over the country are embarking on really difficult um, situations without support, and I think that's really sad. I also will just mention inter-country adoptees and how difficult it is for them, how additionally difficult it is for them. I've had a couple of inter-country adoptees contact me, and I'm afraid in both cases there was very little that I could do to help, just because there were no records available that I could get hold of. And we, you spend time Googling, working with foreign embassies and so forth, and it's just really, really hard. And sometimes even with DNA, it can be hard because not all countries around the world have populations that test. So it's particularly difficult for people who are in that situation, which is really, really tough. Another area, this might sound strange, but particularly as someone with sort of a records background, I'm really conscious that I appear on the official government birth index for England and Wales, My birth is registered under my birth name, and there I am. And nothing's ever going to happen to that person. They won't get married, they won't die, because obviously my identity was changed. And that might sound like a small thing to non-adoptees, but I think it's really important. It really demonstrates what a mess this whole kind of identity around adoption is. It's not right. It's not right. When I look at genealogy all the time, and I hate the idea that in future genealogists will never know what happened to me. They'll be confused. They won't know. There'll be no connection between my birth identity and my adopted identity in the records. And I think that's really, really desperately wrong. And I'll just finish by saying that there is a lot that you can do to um, find your records, trace your family. You can do it, and you don't need to pay somebody to do it. But if I'm perfectly honest, what I would say is that I don't think search angels should exist. I don't think it should be a thing. I don't think there should be any need for it, because adoptees should be able to go to a kind of publicly funded, properly trauma informed service that takes them through finding their records and putting them in touch with their family and supporting them long term, because that's the least I think that we should expect, given that the government really was instrumental in separating us from our families. So that's what I would like to see, and hopefully one day that we'll get closer towards that. So that's what I wanted to mention. Thank you very much.